Clear prop.
Star 738, Yankee number 2, following twin traffic, 3 mile final, clear Sutton. 1 Charlie Bravo, exit in runway 25, going 4 mile final.
This is Behind the Prop with United Flight Systems owner and licensed pilot Bobby Doss and his co-host, Major Airline Captain and designated pilot examiner Wally Mulhern. Now let's go Behind the Prop.
What's up, Wally?
Hey, Bobby, how are you?
Fantastic. We continue to get asked a number of questions as it relates to emergencies, what to do in an emergency. And while we did a show, kind of a potpourri of emergency type topics a few weeks back, we wanted to readdress a number of things that keep coming up in conversation. And I think people, I don't know if people assume or wonder, but they keep asking us when was the last time we declared an emergency? I have yet to declare an emergency. When was the last time you declared an emergency, Wally?
Well, it's funny, or I won't say funny, but it's interesting that you asked that because it was probably about 3 weeks ago. And I'll tell a little story, take about 2 or 3 minutes to tell what happened. I was flying an airline flight, and we were going into Los Angeles. And Los Angeles is a busy airport, busy airspace, Southern California, a lot going on there. And it was a very uneventful flight. In fact, the first officer and I were talking about how, after we landed and kind of debriefed everything, we were talking about how it was one of the more uneventful flights that we've ever had. The seatbelt sign was off pretty much the entire flight, so it was a very smooth flight. Just nothing, absolutely nothing out of the ordinary until about the last 4 minutes of the flight. We were on about a 20-mile final for runway 25 left at LAX. And I don't know what altitude we were at, but we were below 10,000 feet. We were low enough to where the sterile cockpit light was on, which means we're on sterile cockpit light. And I mean, we're in sterile cockpit, so no unnecessary conversations. And even from the flight attendants, they know not to bother us unless it's an emergency. Well, the interphone rang, and the first officer was flying, so I was the what we call the monitoring pilot. And they said we had a customer in the back that was having a medical emergency. And they said, but he seemed to be okay at this point, seemed to be getting better, but they just want to let us know that we did have a medical situation going on in the back.
And maybe we're not all familiar, but you say sterile cockpit, that means I assume you're close to landing. How many, when you got that phone call and you hear this from someone telling you this information, are you 12 minutes, 20 minutes, 3 minutes? How far off are you from touching down?
Yeah, well, in this case, we were probably about 5-6 minutes from touching down, I would say. We put on the sterile cockpit light below 10,000 feet.
Okay.
So, a couple things happen at 10,000 feet. We have to be below 250 knots airspeed, and we get the sterile cockpit light on. But in this case, and when I briefed the flight attendants, I said, look, if it's an emergency, call us. And they understand that. So when I got the call, I knew something was up. They weren't just calling to see, what gate we were going into or anything like that. But anyway, so they said that we had a man back there is having I won't get into all the details of what was going on, but he was, a medical emergency. And so I immediately, we were talking to SoCal Approach, I believe, and I told them we need EMS to meet the airplane at the gate. And I explained to them a little bit about what was going on, told them that it was a male and the approximate age. And that was the end of it, or so I thought. And then about a minute later, at this point now we're maybe 4 minutes from touching down, they called back again and said the guy had taken a turn for the worse. And so at this point, I got on the radio to ATC and I said, we're now declaring an emergency. The guy has gotten worse. And the controller said, well, sir, don't worry about the emergency. We already declared emergency for you. And at this point, they changed our runway to a closer runway to the terminal. They cleared us to land on runway 25 right, which is unusual. 25 right is usually the runway you use for taking off in Los Angeles. You land on 25 left. But anyway, we were cleared to land 25 right, and we were cleared by tower. We were cleared right into the gate. It was I don't know what could have been done to make us get to the gate any quicker. EMS was there. They got the guy off, and I don't know what happened with him, but prayers and everything out to the young man that was having the issue. But what I'm saying is we have this declaration of an emergency in our toolbox as pilots, and was there paperwork involved? Did I have to submit some paperwork? Yeah, I did. I mean, it's all electronic. It's no big deal. It took about 5 minutes out of my day to submit this. So it was just very made me feel really good to know if I'm in the back of an airplane and I'm having a medical emergency, and I'm the one having the situation, that help is close. And you can get help. So don't. We don't want everybody to go out and all of a sudden have a whole slew of emergencies being declared in the next few days after this podcast gets released. But it is something available to us, and again, in our situation, the ATC actually declared the emergency. I didn't use that phrase, declaring an emergency, until the second time around, and at that point, the controller said, well, I've already done that for you.
Yeah, we'll have some ATC people on here shortly as well, and we'll ask that question to them too. Obviously, that's probably a tool in their toolbox, and they use it when they see fit, probably under the same scenario where it's not going to be too terribly painful for them, and they know that you're going to get the expediting that you need to get that thing taken care of. Did you sense on the first phone call? I think I hear this a lot, and maybe your sense of the moment will help. When something starts to go wrong, there might be this ego thing that kicks in where I don't want to declare an emergency. I want to fight through it. I want to figure this problem out. I want to diagnose it myself. And I think people lose time in those circumstances. Did you sense when they called the first time that it was going to be an emergency, or did you sense we've had sick passengers in the past? Was there something in her voice or their voice that might have indicated to you that it was going to get worse?
No, in fact, it was just the opposite. Basically, what I sensed in their voice was we had this situation, but we've pretty much gotten it taken care of. But we just want to let you know that this is what happened in the back.
Gotcha.
And so I got the feeling that, everything is okay. But at that point, I just said, we're going to have EMS meet the airplane. And so I kind of thought I was being a little bit more proactive by having EMS meet the airplane. We do have a service that we can where we can call and via VHF or SATCOM we can talk to medical doctors. But at this point, at 5,000 feet on final to runway 25 left to Los Angeles was not the appropriate time to do that. So we just didn't have time to take care of that.
Well, if you've been flying long at all and you're listening to this show, you've got to be a pilot or an enthusiast to some level. You've probably had that moment where your heart has skipped a beat and or your stomach's kind of gotten up in your throat a little bit. Was within the last couple of months that we took off. I was flying with another person, took off, turned towards our heading. It was a right-hand turn, and I just heard this clunk, 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 clunk. And it got my attention a lot. It sounded as if a flight control was loose, like a flap or an aileron flapping in the winds, right? Took me the better part of 30 seconds to realize that other person had left their seatbelt out the door, and that it was the seatbelt banging off the side of the fuselage, which wasn't making me very happy, but not necessarily an emergency, but something that you would want to resolve fairly quickly. But in that moment, that anxiety that came across me, my mind went into react mode. Like, what am I going to do? Would I declare an emergency? How would I declare an emergency? There wasn't anyone in the tower at that time.
Right.
And I don't know if we practice this enough, right? Not necessarily the emergency, because we've all practiced for check rides and those sorts of things. I think that's one segment of it, but it's really, what am I going to do? And not that one engine failure or the fire example or whatever that might be. All these other things that can happen, from medical emergencies to a seatbelt out the door. I think it was proposed that I'll open the door and pull it back in. I was like, no, you will not do that. That doesn't sound like the best course of action. Maybe the one that saves us the most embarrassment if we could do it, but boy, that doesn't sound like it makes a lot of sense. So I think to me, all of us as pilots should be working on ways to practice and think through these scenarios. There's probably a lot less likely emergency scenario that we're going to have that isn't in a checklist by Cessna, right?
Right.
And what are we really trying to accomplish by declaring an emergency? What did you hope declaring that emergency on the second call would accomplish for you?
Well, a couple things. First of all, expedition. In other words, they would expedite our arrival into, and what I was getting at is before I even finished my breath declaring an emergency, I was going to ask for runway 25 right rather than 25 left. And before I could even catch my breath and ask that, they just cleared us to 25 right. Or they asked us, actually. They said, would you prefer 25 right? Because there's a certain amount of things we have to do with localizer frequencies and everything. We were visual. We could see the airport. We really didn't need to do anything to land on the inboard runway. But at that point, I just, I wanted to say, look, you need to get people out of our way because we need to get in. Not only do we need to get on the ground in a hurry, but we need to get to the gate in a hurry. We need to get this young man medical attention in a hurry. Most of the time we're thinking of, let's get the airplane on the ground. And once we're on the ground, everything is good. Because usually when we're talking about emergencies, we're thinking about a systems problem or something wrong with the airplane. The airplane something is broken. Let's get it on the ground. And now we can stop and catch our breath. But, in a medical emergency, not only do you want to get the airplane on the ground, but you got to get it to where you can get the help to the sick person.
Yeah, so as I think through a lot of the other types of emergencies that may happen, systems related or not, how many times do we hear about fuel incidents that create really bad situations because someone wouldn't, I don't know if it's the right phrase or not, but they didn't declare the emergency. They just said, "Hey, I'm low on fuel." Right. I've watched air disasters enough on the Smithsonian Channel that many of a big crash could be avoided if they would have just declared how terrible of a situation they were really in.
Right.
I'm sure you've heard that and trained for that in your own world, but it's declaring so that you get the expedition, you get the help you need, you clear people out of your way. I think I've watched a show where they put them in a holding pattern because they acted like it was a problem, but they didn't act like it was as big of a problem as it really, really was.
Right.
And had they done that, they would have got those helps, the help that they might have needed in that circumstance.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was going to say the other aspect of an emergency is you don't just have to physically use your mouth and key the mic and use those phrases. There are ways of declaring an emergency, and we all have most of us have a transponder, and that works as well. The big emergency that we deal with usually small general aviation airplanes, or the one that we simulate for the most part, is an engine failure. And that's the big deal. That is the big deal on a commercial and on a private check ride. That's something we are required to test, and we simulate an engine failure. Well, most of these airplanes, or most of the flight schools, I should say, teach the students ABC, airspeed, best place to land, and checklist. I would say 99.99% of my applicants are really good about the airspeed. As soon as we do a simulated engine failure, they'll say pitch for best airspeed, and I would like to take that one step farther, and I would say instead of saying let's pitch for best airspeed, let's trim for best airspeed. Because what happens is, let's say the best glide speed is in this airplane is 80 knots. Let's say, well, they'll pitch for it, but then when their eyes go out the window looking for a place to land, maybe they're forgetting, and we're lowering the nose, and lo and behold, now we're not doing 80 knots anymore. So I would say, rather say pitch for best airspeed, trim for best airspeed.
And just so we're clear, and everybody that's listening wants to challenge this, we're looking at a POH right now of a Cessna S model, and it doesn't say pitch, it just says airspeed, right?
Right.
So,
right.
Yes, it's the correct nomenclature. The airspeed should be best glide, but I do think the trim will make it much easier on everybody out there for sure.
Yeah. And then then we look for a place to land, and this sometimes takes a lot of time for people to come up with a place to land. So you need to find an open area, whether it be a field or a road, and that's a discussion for another day. Some people are going to say stay away from roads. Some people would say, well, hey, it's a nice hard surface. There are some pitfalls with landing on a road, but again, that's an argument for another day. But then when we do get to the checklist, for the most part, the checklist, there's really, for most of these airplanes, two checklists that you're going to have to deal with. The first checklist is essentially sort of going to be a troubleshooting checklist, and the intent of this checklist is to get the engine started again. And lo and behold, most of the items on this checklist involve fuel. You're gonna put the mixture in, fuel selector, carburetor heat. If you're in a carburetor airplane, that's a fuel thing to me, because where is the ice forming? In the fuel. If you're in a airplane that has a fuel pump, whether it be carbureted or not, probably the fuel pump is going to come on. So probably the first several items on this checklist are going to involve fuel. And then, of course, make sure your mags are on both, and add a little spark to it, and then try to get the engine going again. Okay, so we may or may not get the engine going. If we get the engine going, all right, at least we have a little breathing room. There may still be a problem. It may be that you are on the left fuel tank and you ran the engine out of fuel, but you got plenty of fuel in the right fuel tank. It may be a scary moment, but things may be okay at this point. But if the engine does not come back, you're probably going to have some sort of a checklist that involves a forced landing. Okay, so and depending on the airplane, it may have it talks about flaps, it talks about turning things off,
opening doors.
Yeah, opening doors, and that sort of thing. At the end of the day, most of these checklists never, ever talk about communicating with anybody, telling somebody we're about to put this airplane down in a cotton field that's out in the middle of nowhere. And, I always tell me students or applicants that, good chance that this is going to be a crash landing. You may survive it. Hopefully you will survive it. But there's a good chance that you will be injured. And suppose you're knocked unconscious and you're bleeding. You survived the crash, but you're unconscious and you're bleeding, and it's 24 hours before help comes. That's maybe not an ideal situation. So the question I have is why on these checklists is squawking 7700 or talking to ATC? I think if most people had this scenario happen and they had flight following, I would like to think that they would key the mic and tell ATC, hey, who just had an engine failure were going down in a field. I think I would think most of us would say that. But in a situation where you don't have flight following, how about squawking 7700?
That's going to get some people's attention for sure.
Yeah, and am I saying to do something that's not on a checklist? I guess I am.
Well, and we questioned before we started recording, like, why aren't these items on these checklists? And maybe radios weren't required when these checklists were written.
Yeah. Well,
I would think there's a lot of planes that were sold from the factory without radios.
Yeah.
That they didn't think to communicate necessarily, whether that be transponder or over the airways. But that's an assumption. We're making a total assumption there, but it is interesting that, the communicate part and the squawking part aren't on any of these checklists. And I would think we would want to do that sooner than later. If we incorporated that into our flow of some sort, we would think that there's all kinds of things that could start going wrong. Losing power would be one of those things. If we don't have an alternator turning anymore, and we don't have a strong battery, that could be a problem. So we'd want that 7700 to get in there fairly quickly, so that someone would see where we're at and they could get to us quicker. If I have an ELT I could flip on, that might make a lot of sense if I know I'm going to have a forced landing. And then talking to somebody. If you don't know who to talk to, if I didn't know who to talk to, Wally, what should I do?
121.5.
That's it.
121.5. And as we're sitting here, Bobby, I think most people are. I've got an app on my phone called Flight Radar 24, and it's a flight aware type app, but this will let me track airplanes using ADS-B. But I have my Flight Radar 24 set up so that I get text messages, just to show you what an airplane geek I am. But I get text messages when an airplane squawks 7600 or 7700 worldwide. And I am just sitting here right now, 1 hour ago, I won't give the call sign, but a Cirrus SR-22 squawks 7600. And I can go on and see where the last known place of this airplane was. At, again, 1 hour ago, a G12, whatever that is, this is in a foreign country because the registration is not an N number, squawk 7700, general emergency. Here's, anyway, I won't go through it, but I'm sitting here, I've got multiple alerts of airplanes squawking 70, it's mostly 7600, but a few 7700s. And, some of them, here's a BE-36 squawk 7600 on Friday. So it happens. It happens quite a bit. And so I find this interesting when especially 7700, I'll usually pull it up and see where the airplane is. And if don't have a whole lot to do, I'll do some research and try to figure out what happened to the airplane.
Yeah, I think the squawking is the one that I take away from this conversation. Squawking sooner than later. I don't think I would go against anything that's in the POH, but I think I would definitely be adding 7700 or communicating with someone so that I can be found. And again, we're referencing that engine failure, but there's a lot of things that we should be practicing. What are we going to do if we're in a small single GA aircraft that has a medical emergency? What are we going to do? The thought process is you're probably going to want to help get that person somewhere, depending on what their emergency is. But you're not going to go to the first untowered airport probably, because that's not going to do you a whole lot of good. Then again, that might be right next to a big hospital, and you're aware of that. But you should think through those sorts of things. And I think what we should do as pilots to stay up with our currency and proficiency is actually practice some of these things. The practicing the engine failure for a check ride is one we've all done many, many times. But what about the other stuff, the more reality type things? I left a fuel cap off the plane and I ran out of fuel on the left side. How are we going to deal with that? How do we solve that problem? And what are we going to do if we have to land in a field like that? What if I suck all the gas out of the airplane? What if I got bad gas? I mean, that's more of an engine failure reality than the engine actually quitting completely.
Right.
We talked through magnetos and doing, having to solve for a magneto problem in flight. might be as simple as switching it from left to both or right instead of both. That might completely make the engine run smooth. Is that an emergency? Should I declare it? I think I probably would in a lot of situations.
Yeah.
And I know we've talked about that one in the past, but I think we need to practice that, and I think we need to have a flow and a checklist that we use that probably includes that 7700 and then talking to someone sooner than later as well.
Yeah, and if you do declare an emergency or squawk 7700, you're not going to get a bill in the mail from the FAA. You're not. I mean, that's what your tax dollars go to already. Now, you may get a call from the FAA, the FSDO, and they may just want to know what happened. And just tell them what happened. And they're doing this for data collection, and who knows, maybe it helps other pilots. They can publish what happened. Hey, on this date, this is what happened, and this is what the how they handled the situation. Maybe it wasn't the most ideal way to handle it, but maybe it was. So don't be afraid of that phone call if you do get it, or they ask for further clarifications. In my situation, I had to submit the report about the emergency, and I just explained what happened, and at the end they do ask for suggestions. Do you have any suggestion? Is there any way that we can make this this situation better next time? And I didn't have any suggestions, and I got an email back within 24 hours saying that all my information had been reviewed and accepted, and basically that was the end of it for me.
Yeah, we get a lot of follow-ups here. We've declared emergencies. We've had 7600 squawked, and almost always the FAA does follow up, and it's normally one quick phone call, and we're done. It's not something to be overly concerned about. It's just like you said, them doing data collection and them trying to help other pilots. As it relates to emergencies, I don't think it's going to be if you have to declare one or if you're involved in one, but when you're going to be involved in one. So by all means, practice, work with your safety pilots as you fly around, your friends, as you're building time. Don't just practice the same old one. Practice some other scenarios and other situations and how you may handle them, because I think it's going to surprise all of us when it does come, and it's going to catch us off guard, and we're going to have to learn to react to it. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's just a lot of things that you can have. You can make some decisions before you even this happens. I mean, we're in a coastal community down here. We live. We're right on the Gulf of Mexico. So here's a scenario. Let's say you're flying along the coast. Out to the left is the Gulf of Mexico, and to the right is the beach, and you have an engine failure. Well, where are you going to put the airplane? Are you going to put it on the beach? Are you going to put it just barely in the water? Are you going to put it in the water?
What kind of airplane am I in?
That's
going to make me.
That's a good point. So,
and is it mine or am I renting it?
Yeah, exactly.
I'm joking.
Exactly. So and I mentioned this earlier. I have the discussion with people a lot. Do you like a field or do you like a road? And there's a couple different schools of thought out there. I know what I would like to do.
Well, ideally, I'd like to find an abandoned runway somewhere too. But if that's not an option, I think I know what I want to do too. And I think I was taught a few things during my training, and you should talk to your instructors. Which is better, water? If I've fixed gear, is water, trees, or a muddy field better, right? I mean, you got to think about energy and how we're going to displace this energy. Do I want to be upside down? Do I want to be upright?
Right.
There's a lot of reasons why you might pick some trees instead of buildings, and you don't know. You might be trapped and have to make that decision one day. Think through that. Talk through that with somebody.
Yeah.
The road situation is one that gets a lot of debate, but I can almost predict that I'm going to pick a road over a lot of other circumstances.
Yeah.
Especially if I know that power lines are running beside that road and not across that road.
Right.
it's going to be a pretty good outcome, is my guess.
Yeah.
If you choose with traffic or there is no traffic at all. So I think it is practice. I think it's talking through it. I think it's doing everything you can to be as prepared as you can when this day comes, because this day is likely going to come for all of us, where we have to react to something that is an emergency, declare that emergency, and get the help that we need for sure.
Another one to think about is in a retractable gear airplane. Let's say 2 of the 3 landing gear come down. You going to land with 2 gears down and 1 up, or are you going to pull the gear up and land with all of them up?
I'm probably going to land with them up.
See, I'm going to take what I can get. I'd land with 2 down. So I mean, it's 2 different, and they're both right.
Yeah.
Neither one of them is wrong, but I've already made that decision. So that's what I'm going to do. And so in the time of stress, I really don't have to think about that. Now, can I change my mind? Can maybe circumstances dictate changing my mind? Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm going to have to challenge you that maybe off the air, but 2 wheels down over a sandy beach near water, what are you going to do? That's probably going to change things. But with that, we'll wrap it up. This has kind of been the follow-up to some emergency stuff. We're not perfect. We don't have all the right answers, but we definitely think you should put some thought and practice into these scenarios as well. As always, thanks for listening to the show, and stay behind the prop.
Thanks for checking out the Behind the Prop podcast. Be sure to click subscribe and check us out online at BehindTheProp.com. Behind the Prop is recorded in Houston, Texas. Creator and host is Bobby Doss. Co-host is Wally Mulhern. The show is for entertainment purposes only and is not meant to replace actual flight instruction. Thanks for listening, and remember, fly safe.